Aloha, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And thank you for joining us for this WPS special, Mental Health, SGBV, and Policy Planning. My name is Rob York, Director for Regional Affairs at the Pacific Forum, Editor of Pacific Forum's publications, Director of its Fellowships and Internships programs, and your MC for today. For the past several years, Pacific Forum has carried out a number of programs under the banner of Women, Peace, and Security, including on issues such as military and civilian cooperation, and on maritime environmental security, women in the defense sector, women's suffrage, gender concerns and disaster response, and other topics. Today's program is an extension of that mission. More information regarding our work can be found in the chat box now. Pacific Forum also offers both resident and non-resident Women, Peace, and Security Fellowships, which you can also learn about through the chat box now. Today, we are joined by three distinguished experts in the field of women, peace, and security as they discuss the impact of sexual and gender-based violence, or SGBV, on survivors' well-being, as well as how SGBV can be prevented and how to work with survivors. Current and historical examples of SGBV will be discussed, covering North Asia, as well as best practices in contemporary rehabilitation. First, we will have Elizabeth Longdahl, Director of Mental Health and Info, who will introduce us to Mental Health and Human Rights Info's mission before discussing the need for training of helpers working with survivors of human rights violations. There will be a special focus on 3 manuals prepared for capacity building among helpers engaged in work with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence against women, but also men and children. More information about her work can be found in the chat box. After Elizabeth will be Nora Spias, Professor Emeritus at the Department of Psychology and Chair of the Board at Mental Health and Human Rights Info, who will introduce the subject of mental health and human rights with a special focus on conflict-related sexual violence, prevention, prohibition, and rehabilitation of survivors. You can find more information about her and her career in the chat box now. Our last but by no means least speaker for today will be Betsy Kawamura, founder of Women for Nonviolence in Peace and Conflict Zones. She has worked internationally to empower other survivors, especially those of Asia-Pacific origin, through instruments including UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on WPS. Her presentations and workshops in Europe, Asia, and the US have been geared toward raising the voices of GBV survivors, including those of North Korea, for political policy changes toward peace. Her active global network helps forward awareness of WPS issues from grassroots levels all the way to the UN offices and to the International Criminal Court. She will talk about Okinawa's Recreation and Amusement Association, as well as the US Task Forces agreement with Japan. For more about her, please check the chat box now. I want to thank each of our distinguished participants for being here today. We look forward to your remarks and the fruitful discussion that will certainly follow. After our panelists' presentations, we will transition to a Q&A segment where we will welcome feedback and questions from the audience. Now for our first presentation, which will come from Elizabeth. The floor is yours.
And thank you so much for this opportunity to share our work and our website, which I will talk a little bit about. And so we are a database that was initiated in 2003. We are sharing information about how human rights violations are affecting our mental health, and with a focus on disaster, conflict, and wars. We have gathered information from the internet, and we have evaluated it and gone through it to make sure that this information that we share is of value and from a qualitative source. And we want it to be free and available for everyone, because we know that a lot of our helpers working in the field of mental health have little access or little money to pay for information. So that's one of our issues that we wanted to be available for everyone. On our web page, we have a database resource page where you can seek the different publications and guidelines and manuals, but we also have a cure page with different thematic pages that you can look into. And the topic for today is our 3 manuals. So we'll talk a little bit more about them. But first, why focus on mental health in war and conflict? Nearly 132 million people in 42 countries around the world will need humanitarian assistance resulting from conflict or disaster. And nearly 69 million people worldwide have been forcibly displaced by violence and conflict, and this is the highest number since World War II. In 2019, WHO estimated that there are more people living with mental health disorder in areas affected by conflict than we previously thought. 1 person in 5 is living with some form of mental disorder, from mild depression or an anxiety to psychosis. These people desperately need to be able to obtain treatment and care. Their disorder often impairs their ability to function. So access to care isn't just about improving mental health. It can be a matter of survival. So this was from Mark van Ommeren in WHO. So this is one of the core reasons why we started this organization. Nora Sveas, that we'll talk later, is the initiator, and she saw the need for something that could be available around the world in the need after catastrophes or in war or conflict. So our main focus now is mental health and gender-based violence, and how we can help survivors of sexual violence in conflict and war. And we have made initially we made a training manual for helpers working with women. We have traveled around the world with this manual, and it is freely available on a web page. We wanted to make sure that this manual was applicable in different countries, different cultures, different religious backgrounds. So we tried it out in 5 different countries when we were writing the manual. So we traveled to Cambodia, to Colombia, to Turkey, Jordan, and of course Norway, and tried out the different tools of the manual to see that this could be useful for different survivors from different backgrounds and in different situations. We also want to make you aware that this is not just tools that can be used in war and conflict, but also with violence in domestic situations, domestic violence, and different situations which is not typically war and conflict. So when we went to Mexico, it's not a war and conflict country, but it's definitely situations that are war and conflict similar. So we want to make sure that this is also something that could be useful in countries that are not affected by war and conflict. So why this gender-based violence training manual? There is a strong need to establish good mental health assistance and support to women who have suffered this form of violence. And we try to advocate for an approach where mental health and psychosocial support and somatic care is provided as an integrated assistance. But this requires that helpers are prepared and ready to provide such assistance. The first initiative that we took related to this was because we traveled around and we saw that in big refugee camps, we knew that maybe 3 out of 5 women had experienced this type of violations. So we knew that some sort of help had to be made, but a lot of helpers didn't dare to raise the question because they were afraid of asking the wrong questions or opening wounds that they couldn't help closing. So this is why the manual was made. So a little bit about the manual. It focuses, of course, on mental health and psychological reactions to traumatic events. It has practical interventions, exercises, and skills training, because we know that just reading theoretical guidelines and manuals is very helpful, but when you're in the situation, it's also good to know how to do these practical interventions and skills. And we are also very resource oriented, because we know that the helper has resources, the survivor herself has resources, and the community they live in have resources. So we build on the resources that are already available. We build on experience and local knowledge. When we do training, we always do this in collaboration with local organizations. So we know that the local organizations are the ones with the closest contact with the survivors and know what the survivor needs. There are lots of tools in the training. This can be used as supervision, group work, or self-study. And what we want to emphasize is that it needs to be adaptable for the local context that we are working in. And we also, as a part of the manual, have a helping the helpers section, because we know that we need to strengthen awareness and build the helpers' knowledge and insight. And we know that being a helper requires a lot of empathy, and we know that the empathy also can affect your own mental health. So we know that the helpers also have to protect herself to be a good helper. And we want to emphasize that this manual is a human rights-based approach, protecting and respecting the dignity and mental health and physical integrity of all. It has a value-based approach based on international human rights principles as guiding and basis. Understanding violence and psychological trauma in a human rights perspective. And also that there is a responsibility of states to prevent violence and abuse and prohibit torture and ill treatment and provide protection and assistance to survivors. So as we said, we have a main focus on the helper and her experience and providing tools. So a large part of the manual is how to support the helper so that she can reflect on her own practices and how she can use the tools she already have, but also learn some new one. This is a drawing that one of our writers found on the wall of the helper in Congo. So this is how they look upon the tools that are important for the work that they are doing. On our webpage, there is a small animation about the butterfly woman, which is the core metaphor of the manual. So the metaphor is used because we know that it can be difficult for women talking about what have happened. So instead of asking the woman who have experienced these abuses, we tell a story and let her know about what can be trauma reaction, how will the trauma affect her mental health, and we have a focus on the past and the future and try to get the survivor stable in the middle between the past and the future. So the metaphor goes through all the tools through this story about the butterfly woman, her good life, and when the life is turned upside down, when she's experiencing triggers and flashbacks, and when she's gradually healing. We want to emphasize that this is a psychoeducative approach to learning and to experiencing what a survivor can have experienced herself, also through triggers, and how to heal. By using the story, we have an indirect approach to trauma and the consequences of trauma. The story is psychologically accurate, and it shows examples how a traumatic event affects a survivor and how she can learn how to deal with it. We externalize what happens, and the survivor and the helper look at it together from a distance. And on this, we establish a ground in which feelings and reaction can be discussed, and with less danger to opening wounds. So when we were doing trainings with the women's manual, we were asked about what do we do with the boys and men, because we know that this also happens with boys and men, and it has been underreported, and it is on time to also talk about what have happened to boys and men in this relation. And in that regard, we also made a manual for helpers working with children in war and conflict areas and with in low resource communities. And we know that in situation with conflict and humanitarian crisis, and when the natural or law and order is out of balance, there are more situations of violations of children in this respect. So Robert, I'll give the mic back to you.
All right. Thank you very much for letting us know all of that information about the manuals. We will have more questions about them momentarily, but for now, I will turn the floor over to Nora.
Thank you so much for this invitation to share concerns and experiences in this important field, that is combating sexual and gender-based violence against women. But also, as mentioned already by Elizabeth, we know that such violence is also a challenge in relation to boys and children as well, boys, men, and children as well. Nevertheless, I will in the following concentrate on the global efforts to fight violence against women through measures and initiatives to prohibit, prevent, and report, rehabilitate survivors, as well as holding those responsible for these crimes to account. Elizabeth has described some of the practical approaches. What can we do? How can we deal with the suffering and the trauma that many of the survivors are living with? I will touch upon more the overarching aspects that may strengthen our policy in the field. And in doing this, I will refer both to my background as a former member of the UN Committee Against Torture, and also as a psychotherapist to survivors of torture, including also rape and other forms of sexual violence. Given our work and shared interest in this area, it is an honor to address you today. And we know that the Pacific Forum has women, peace, and security as one of its key focus areas. This, of course, implies focus both on the understanding of the impact that such violence has on peace and security, and on the need to develop strategies and policies for preventing and repairing the violence, and also establishing accountability for those crimes in peacetime as well as in wartime. The first slide. I will start with a quotation by Kofi Annan. It's a famous one, and he has said that violence against women is perhaps the most shameful human rights violation, and it is perhaps the most pervasive. It knows no boundaries of geography, culture, or wealth. And as long as it continues, we cannot claim to be making real progress towards equality, development, and peace. Despite these strong words from Kofi Annan, we know so well that it has not always been like that. It has taken many, many years and hard advocacy work to have this form of violence acknowledged, even acknowledged as human rights violations, as torture, as crime against humanity, and in situations of conflict and war, also as war crimes. The process by which violence against women may be considered torture in the context of the UN Convention Against Torture, next, and cruel and degrading treatment and punishment. This process I have described in an article I wrote together with a colleague, also member of the UN Committee Against Torture, where we describe all the work to actually look at violence against women as also torture and something of concern to the Convention Against Torture. So today I will also give a brief historical overview of some of the important steps related to sexual crimes in a context of conflict and war. But to start with the main point, and actually almost my conclusion, namely, it matters a lot how the violence that we are combating is called and framed. Because the way in which gender and sexual violence is defined and framed will entail rights, obligations, and responsibilities. The international defined and agreed upon human rights laid down in conventions and declarations include rights to protection, to justice, to reparation, also rehabilitation. So just to use CAT or the Convention Against Torture as a point of reference, in the convention, there's a total prohibition of torture and ill treatment, and there's a very strong obligation on the part of the states to prevent such violence. Further, in the general comment number 2, describes also sexual violence also by private actors as a concern to the convention and to the committee. And it does define, finally, the right to report and protection while denouncing torture or ill treatment. And last but not least, the right to redress, including rehabilitation. So next. So my important point here is to underline that the way we speak about it, the way we frame gender-based violence is something that matters, because including it in policy documents, we can refer to internationally acknowledged state art obligations. So it's a lot more than mere wishes. It's something which is in their obligations, and we have to remind states of this. So if we go back and look into this history, I mentioned that it took a long time before these gender-based violence, also in war and conflict, were considered human rights violations as such. I remember myself in the 80s going to Geneva asking for funding for a project for raped women in the wars. And we were met with, sorry, this is not war crime, this is not torture. This, of course, changed during the years to come, and today the situation is quite different. But let us just look at what has happened. Because we know that sexual gender-based violence in war and conflict is extremely high. We know from the Bosnian War, we know from the Rwandan genocide, we know that the high number among Liberian women were raped during the civil war. We have already spoken about Congo, tens of thousands of women raped during the conflict. We know from the conflict in Colombia as well. Next. And we know also numerous reports on sexual violence in the Asian Pacific region, and recent reports or reports from 17 and 18 underline the problem in different parts of the country. And also recent reports urged China, for instance, to protect women who have gone from North Korea, who are living at the border of China, very much at risk of trafficking, sexual slavery, and also different other kinds of sexual violence. So this is a problem, and we know it's happening, and it is absolutely an obligation of states to prevent and do something with this. Next. But turning again to history, we know that rape and other forms of violence are prohibited in both international law and in non-international armed conflict. And it's important to remind ourselves that Article 3, which is common to all the 4 Geneva Conventions in the humanitarian laws, prohibit violence to life and person. And this includes also treatment of torture and outrages upon the person, which is often understood as sexual violence. Next. So this again underlines that sexual violence, as we know it, is strictly forbidden also in the context of the humanitarian law, concretely the Geneva Conventions. So how was sexual and gender-based violence in conflict regarded before the 1990s? In most cases, abusers were not convicted. It was seen as collateral damage. This happens in all wars. Conflict-related sexual violence was seriously underreported. There was no documentation or systematic research. It was not a part of the human rights agenda, as already underlined, not considered politically relevant, but thanks to the work of civil society groups and action and awareness, this has changed very strongly. So today, I could draw this a long line, but I will just mention some very few important changes in this process. First of all, the International Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, the ECTY, defined rape as a crime against humanity for the first time. In 1994, the Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda said that rape constitutes a war crime and also a crime against humanity. And actually, this court was the first international court to find a person accused of rape as guilty for these kinds of crimes. And finally, and very important, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court defined wartime sexual violence on its list of crimes against humanity and war crimes. So from being collateral damage, it happens in all war, we see already in 2002 a great step forward to defining these as serious international crimes. Next. And the ICC did list as sexual crimes, they included rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, or any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity. I think Navi Pillay, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2014, she put very fine words into this terrible crime because she said that victims of sexual violence, they bear the cost of the harm they suffered with dramatic physical, psychological, and material consequences, and that this destroys not only their life, but also often the lives of their children. And it also creates irreparable damage to the very fabric of society, and in turn poses serious threats to the prospects of reconciliation and sustainable peace and development. And we're all, of course, very strongly aware of the fact that rape and sexual violence does create a danger and risk also the fabric of society is probably the main reason why this is used as a tool of war. Next. In response to this persistent pressure from civil society, and I mentioned what had happened both in the ICTY, in the Rwanda Tribunal, and also in the Permanent Criminal Court. But then after this, Security Council has adopted 10 resolutions on women, peace, and security. And there's a long list, and you probably know all of them. And of course, it all started with the Security Council Resolution 1325 in 2000, where for the first time, women's security is considered relevant to the international peace and security by the UN Security Council. And all of these Security Council resolutions mentioned here also refer very strongly to sexual violence, to other forms of violence against women in conflict and war, but it also relates to conflict against women, against children, and also against men. It says in one of the resolutions, also our brothers are attacked by this form of violence. And the resolutions are continuing, and of course they give and they underline the necessity of international society to deal with this. Next. And of course, 1325 is so much more than a number or a resolution, because I would say that in many ways, 1325 is a historical watershed of political framework. And it shows how important the gender perspective has come in negotiating peace agreements, planning refugee camps and peacekeeping operations. And I'm sure, and I've also looked at your own work from the Pacific Forum, that this is all included in your work and your policy plans, which is extremely good. So going back to what I started with, that the recognition of sexual violence under international humanitarian and human rights law as crime of war, crime against humanity, implies the right to justice and to redress. And this means, again, that defining it this way, it does open the door for rights, including for rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is a very long process. The work that we're doing in the MHRI in our manuals is just the beginning. It's psychological first aid. It's getting on track, perhaps, to see your life back on track after having been exposed to serious violations of this sort. But it's not a full rehabilitation. That is a long, multidisciplinary process. So I will soon close. Looking, but I want to mention very quickly the severe consequences of sexual violence. It's on the individual survivor. The world is torn apart. One is always feeling alone and almost frozen in one's feelings. The family and group is affected. Violence has been regarded as a part of ethnic cleansing, so it means that it does attack families and groups. It aims at destroying the community from the inside. It makes it difficult to deal with the present, and it makes it difficult to deal with the past. Shame and guilt may overshadow everything, and the future is often felt like completely gone, often feelings of being excluded, sometimes also clearly marginalized. And then we know the many children born of rape. So what is needed urgently is a strong mental health assistance to women, children, and men who have suffered this form of violence. It is advocate for an approach where mental health and psychosocial support is provided as an integrated assistant, not only somatic help, not only psychological, it has to go together. It requires that helpers are prepared and ready to provide such assistance, and we hope that our manuals at least can be a good beginning here. And the work should be based on human rights principle and have a human rights-based approach, because we're dealing with serious human rights violations. So going back again to the naming and framing of gender-based violence, including by private actors, and that this is seen as violence against the conventions. And I could refer to a lot of different conventions here. We know that doing this, we may open up for the rights that people who have suffered from the violation may have. We must remind states of their obligations, not only to prohibit and prevent, but also to rehabilitate and support. And we do hope that this comes together with a process of compensation and justice to those who have suffered this form of violence. Thank you very much, and I'm very much open to questions when we have gone through all the 3 presentations. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. And with that, we will turn it over to our final speaker, and that would be Betsy. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, or actually nearly good afternoon for you folks in Hawaii. Thank you very much. And just to say that I've known Rob York for many years now, and I really appreciate the opportunity for Elizabeth and Nora and I to discuss this. I've been working with Nora and Elizabeth for many years now with mental health and human rights information. My NGO is called Women for Nonviolence in Peace and Conflict Zones. And actually, I'm an American who's been living between USA and Oslo for a while. The reason I made or created this non-government organization is that I myself am a survivor, repeated survivor of sexual gender-based violence as a young child in Okinawa, the tiny island south of Japan. And as a child, I went through incredible tough processes without much redress or amelioration. And unfortunately, furthermore, in my early 30s, I also went through gender-based violence again under the forms of various issues and homelessness. So I do know a little bit about what I'm talking about from personal experiences and not just from ivory tower situations. Next, please. Megan, can you turn the next? Okay. To begin with, many people are asking me, so why is gender-based violence, why should gender-based violence should be such an important topic to speak about? Currently, we are going into our second year in terms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I wanted to really stress to the international audience the impact it has on Asia Pacific. Obviously, when we look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, now we're looking at perceived, increased threats from North Korea and China, and basically like how it is to protect Hong Kong and Taiwan from the issues. But I always tell the people that I lecture to that it's, to really understand security issues in Asia Pacific, you're going to have to understand the history of gender-based violence of the Asian Pacific region. So I wanted to clarify that I have a lot of information on my slides, but I didn't want the audience to panic that you don't have to read everything. I'm just going to go through the main points. And my initiative was to provide this information on the next following pages so you can take it home as references for your future. And I was just going to mention to Rob that whoever wants a copy of my PowerPoint, they're most welcome. So please don't feel that you have to read every page. I'll just be going over the main pages, and you can read the rest on your own. So as I said, I've been telling people that the best way to understand women, peace, and security processes in Northeast Asia is go through the histories. One of the more important things right now is that Jens Stoltenberg, the leader of NATO, has talked about potentially putting a NATO office in Japan. And also just want to emphasize that Republic of Korea is supposed to be the UN Security Council from 2024 to 25. And Japan's Prime Minister Kishida is mulling over nuclear sharing with the USA. This obviously means that Far East Asia will have increased ramifications on women, peace, and security issues, namely the fact that the US military force is expanding in Asia Pacific. I understand that in the Philippines, the forces have doubled. Mainland Japan is talking about perhaps expanding its military bases in Okinawa, which I will go over later in more detail. And one of the key issues that are brought up repeatedly is that the Okinawans are very much fighting to have the status of force agreements to be updated and changed in terms of greater rights for prosecution and greater human rights in the island of Okinawa. And I just had the great pleasure of meeting personally with Governor Denny Tamaki when he was in Hawaii during the Japan-Hawaii Summit. I happened to be at the Pagoda Hotel, and I'd exchanged a few words with Denny Tamaki. And I approached him with the intentions of perhaps inviting him to Europe or to countries outside the United States to discuss more the issue of Okinawa under the spotlight of North Asian security and nuclear risk issues. I just wanted to point out too that in comparison to other countries in the world, the USA basically has 750 foreign bases in 80 nations. In other words, the US has 3 times as many bases as all other countries. Next page, please. I'm sure that you all at Pacific Forum know where Okinawa is, but this is mainly made for a European audience. So as you can see, Okinawa is a tiny red circled island south of Japan, and strategically it's very important because it's located right close to Taiwan. It's very close to China, and if you scroll down further, it's very close to the Philippines and Vietnam. So basically during during the Vietnam War, Okinawa was incredibly important as the operational rehearsal place to prepare the soldiers to go to Vietnam. And I write the words NIMBY, not in my backyard. The reason why I mentioned not in my backyard is that mainland Japan is very reluctant to expand US military forces on the mainland, but they said that Okinawa should be a better place. The problem is that Okinawa is like a land. It has only 0.6% of Japan's total land area, while it has basically crammed in 70% of all the US military forces. And when I was living in Okinawa from about 1963 to about 1974, I lived very close at the mouth of the Kadena Air Force Base. Next, please. And this is just to give you an idea later on when you want to dig through my PowerPoint of the different types of military bases. Next, please. This is again, is just showing that Okinawa's share of US military, Japan's total area is like 0.6%, while it basically is a burden. It's carrying basically 70.4% of all the military bases in Japan. Next, please. And just to, as a reference, the areas marked in blue are the US military bases, whereas the ones marked in red are the Russian. So you can see the vast contrast in the size. So USA is definitely the world's most powerful military in many aspects. Next, please. Now, as Nora said, we all discuss Resolution 1325, and I'm not going to repeat what Nora has said. I think after looking at 1325, I think we need to really ask ourselves how useful it is. Many times when we discuss 1325 in Norway, we talk about the national action plans that different countries have. And I applaud the efforts of the various countries, including the Philippines and Japan, South Korea, and many other countries who developed national action plans. But many of us as survivors of gender-based violence, we're really wondering, can people walk the talk? In other words, what would happen if countries violate 1325? An obvious example right now is Russia. We hear accounts of Russia's sexual gender-based violence in Ukraine. So I understand that a lot of evidence is being collected by various NGOs and UN experts. But the thing is that trying to bring justice on violating 1325 and the allied resolutions is a very arduous thing. Next slide, please. The reason why I say it's very arduous is that, for example, China is not part of the ICC. Russia is not part of the ICC, and neither is the United States. So when you have these larger power countries that are not part of the Rome Statute violating 1325, which is part of the UN Security Council, how do we prosecute them? So that's a discussion for later on. I bring up the National Action Plan of South Korea. In my experience, I found the South Korean National Action Plan to be one of the better ones in Far East Asia. The reason is that they really give credit to the comfort woman, the sexual slavery of the Korean woman who had to go to sexual slavery by the Japanese Imperial Army. They also very nicely mentioned North Korean refugee women who have to hide in China. Nora very nicely mentioned the huge problem of the North Korean refugees hiding into China to try to escape. Most of them are women. Their estimates are at this point, about 500,000 North Korean women are hiding in China. And very much of the majority go through some kind of gender-based violence, including a lot of them going through forced marriages in the forms of human trafficking. So what I really applaud about the National Action Plan for South Korea is that they do mention the North Korean refugees women, and they do also mention the comfort woman of the Korean woman forced into sexual slavery with the Japanese Imperial Army. Next, please. And now I briefly would like to mention the National Action Plan of USA and the National Action Plan of the United States. The National Action Plan for Japan was passed in September 2015, and I have the links for both. I have links for both the Japanese National Action Plan and the USA one. The problem with the Japanese National Action Plan is that it doesn't mention at all the Korean or Japanese comfort woman. It does not matter that it does not mention the need to update the status of force agreements. And it doesn't really mention, well, the only good thing actually is that it does show interest in human trafficking victims. So I see like a serious disconnect. I also mentioned the USA National Action Plan. That was an executive order by former President Obama. Unfortunately, like the ones in Japan, it doesn't mention sexual gender-based violence carried out by the US military in Asia Pacific, nor does it mention the need to update the status of force agreement. And it doesn't really mention US military sexual violence and reparations and addressing the issues as well. So those two, they really stuck out in me, that there seems to be not much claw or not much, action to what they really say they're set out to do in terms of the spirit of 1325. I also mentioned on the bottom, we're looking at major parties on the UN Security Council, China and Russia. But I really don't think they have a national action plan that is waiting for us to analyze. And as I said, it's with deep regret that we see Russia vehemently ignoring 1325, although they signed up to it. So it's going to be the burden of the rest of us in the Western world, or the burden on the survivors and the victims, to be able to bring Russia to justice. Next slide, please. I mentioned this, the UN panel called for revising the Japan and South Korea comfort women debate. And there's been a lot of discussion on the fact that many of the South Korean comfort women are still not very happy with the outcomes of what the Japanese government have basically created for them in terms of reparation. And what I really wanted to say about this, and this is jumping forward, preliminary to my next slide, is that what I do find comforting, though, is that the ROK government really platformed the voices of the Korean comfort women who actually sexually served the U.S. military. I mean, not the Japanese military. And every time I went to the UN Commission on the Status of Women, the USCSW, in New York for several years in a row, I was profoundly moved by how many platforms or how many discussion forums there were hosted by the ROK government on discussing South Korean comfort women. And I will talk to you about how this is in sharp contrast to this group called the RAA, the Recreation and Amusement Association. Next slide, please. Now, I will go through this really quickly, but as I said before, you can have a copy of this so you can go through all the links. As we all know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed by the US military forces in August 6, 1945, and Japan capitulated to the USA. It was, in my opinion, a very sad and regrettable situation that the Japanese government, shortly after Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed and announced the capitulation, they basically had set up a organized prostitution called the Recreation and Amusement Association to sexually serve the US military. Now, I don't know about you folks, but I don't see anything recreational and amusing about sexual slavery, especially when the sexual slavery is done by capitulated, impoverished and destitute women, supposedly sexually serving those who came into Japan as heroes. I find it profoundly regrettable that the Allied forces, calling themselves heroes in trying to create some kind of justice, freeing Nazi Germans from in Europe and coming to Japan to so-called declare victory over Japan, and unfortunately using the bodies of Japanese women and going for it. And apparently this was totally done under the full knowledge of General Douglas MacArthur, who was the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces then. And this was also done under the full knowledge of then President Truman. According to what I've read so far, there were about 55,000 Japanese women employed. And the way that the Japanese government tried to employ or recruit this woman was that they were saying that this was a chance for Japanese women to serve their country. And of course, as it doesn't take too much imagination to think that those who offered their services were women who basically lost their families, lost their husbands, totally impoverished and had no other means of supporting or sustaining themselves. And I understand that there was one account of this one woman serving about 45 to 60 clients per day, and she earned $2 US. And what I also find profoundly interesting is that back from about 2000, I would say back from about 2016, I launched on a series of telephone interviews with U.S. military academies on whether they knew about the story of the Recreation and Amusement Association. Some of the military academies, and I can discuss this later with you folks individually, did say that they knew about the RA, but they didn't actively teach it in their classes. To that extent, I wonder if the military academies also know much about the South Korean comfort woman, because as I will show you later, Asia Pacific, namely Korea, Japan, Vietnam, have been deeply affected by the US military. I mentioned, next page, please. So next page, please. So basically, the rest of the presentations, I just wanted to give you like a basic background of this. Next page, please. I'll be done in about 30 seconds. I wanted to go to the status of forces agreements of USA and Japan. The status of force agreements basically indicates the league that establishes the framework under which the US military personnel operate in overseas military bases. And it basically covers jurisdictional protocols. And many of the survivors and myself, we basically explained that we need to reevaluate on the SOFA Articles 16, 17, and 18. And this is in light of the fact that we expect the expansion and the discussion of the US military in Asia Pacific. And thus, it would be very natural for all of us to really encourage the updating of the status of force agreements, especially in the spirit of UN Security Council Resolution 1325. And I'll just let Megan flip through the next pages because these are just reference points. I know that my time is up, so I don't want to take up your time. So I mentioned in the next pages the different articles and a survivor. And so I guess that's all I wanted to explain. And my conclusion, next page, please. Next. Yeah, my conclusion is that reconciliation is best achieved when people talk about issues that are not very comfortable. A friend of mine who's with the Peace Research Institute of Oslo said, the requisite for reconciliation is acknowledging essential facts, however disagreeable to oneself. And he was talking about trying to explain the East Asian piece. So I'm sorry I went a little bit over time, but basically as a nutshell, coming from a survivor's perspective, I'm working with the various UN Security Council resolutions and doing advocacy trips to the UN New York, and hope that you folks can do a little bit more research on this area so we can have some kind of systematic awareness of these issues and to create amelioration. Thank you very much. I'll give you back to Rob then.
All right. Thanks to all of our presenters for this time that they've shared with us and this information. Now we will open the floor to questions from our audience. As a reminder to everyone, there are two ways that you may submit your questions or feedback for the speakers. The first is to chat in your question using the question and answer function located at the bottom of the Zoom window. The second is to raise your virtual hand, also located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Once you have been called on, Pacific Forum staff will enable your microphone. Please be ready to unmute yourself so you can verbally ask your question, and be sure to state your name and affiliation for the group. Great. With that, I would like to ask the first question, and it is for Elizabeth. You mentioned the countries that you have prepared the manuals for, the languages, which include Cambodia, Colombia, and Jordan. I want to ask how you selected those countries, and also, are there plans to take this manual to additional countries in the future?
Thank you for your question. We wanted to have this broader view, so we tried to find organizations that we have that we knew that were working with survivors of gender-based violence, and we also wanted it to be different languages and different religious, cultural background. You might think that Turkey and Jordan is very close in the sense that they're in the Middle East, both of them, but with the organization that we were working with in Jordan, they had collected it's called, the organization is called Arab Collective, and they had gathered organizations from Palestine, from Syria, from Jordan, from Egypt. Nora, you have to help me with it. It's you know, it's almost 10 years back, but from different countries. So some of these organizations we have worked with previously, and other ones were through connections, but we wanted it to be diverse. So that was the background. And I can just mention that except from the Spanish one, all the translations of the manuals have been initiated by local organizations.
I could just add very briefly, because this was when we were designing or developing the manuals itself. So this was during the process of writing. But then afterwards, we have been throughout, or a lot of countries, and recently a Nepalese version has been translated. So we've been trying it actively out after it was written in many countries. So there's still a lot to go, but we have had some very interesting experiences how it is working across both language, culture, religion, etc., with modifications all the time, of course. So thank you. And I want to take the opportunity to thank Betsy also for sharing such strong experiences. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to mention that Nora and Elizabeth both they worked on a handbook in Korean. I just want to remind them. Can you tell us a little bit about the Korean?
Well, we had a couple of training in South Korea, and what we did translate there, or what those who wanted to translate it and use it, they picked out the so-called toolbox, because this, for those of you who are working in a practical setting, we have the manual itself is quite wide and big, but we have also developed a toolbox with more specific approaches and concrete ways of approaching survivors. And that has been translated into the Korean language. Thank you for reminding us.
Yeah.
So we have a question in the chat box from Charity Borg, who is our WPS fellow. And she asked a question to all three of you, which is, what steps do you think military to military engagements and training should take to improve a shared understanding and commitment to preventing and prosecuting gender-based violence in peacetime, crisis, and conflict? Let's start with Betsy, and then we can go to Elizabeth and Nora.
Okay, I'll just say a few words on it. We hear this constantly. There was recently a launch of the new National Action Plan for Norway that was launched last week. And one of the key statements is that they really want to make sure that the military does the prevention and do the accountability. I laud that very much, but as I've explained in my part of the presentation, you know, trying to create accountability and prevention has to be done with some kind of passionate personal will, even beyond political will. You can have all the resolutions in the world and all the rules and everything, but if nobody enforces that, and if in the military system, if people don't call each other out, I think calling each other out is one of the most crucial things to do in terms to basically identify the crime and to seek adjudication and justice. Nora, Elizabeth?
Nora, you're muted.
Yes, and I'd like to just to add up to what you're saying there, because this is an extremely relevant question, and it's a question that we worked with also a lot, of course, in the UN, given also some of the terrible crimes that we've seen that even peacekeeping forces have been committing against civilians, which is, of course, something which is just far beyond any form of acceptance. So I think one of the most important points that we have to make is working with the military in terms of awareness and training, and really also holding them to account if they don't do the training and don't follow or walk the talk. I just want to give an example. One of my colleagues, who was a military psychiatrist, presented about 30-40 years ago in a big NATO military meeting. He was talking about the need to stop all forms of sexual violence performed by soldiers, and he was practically laughed at and say, hey, what kind of man was he? Didn't he understand that war is war and military are men? So, and of course, that would not be possible to say today. So things have happened, and we have to look at the process. Today, things are part of the schedule, it's part of the curriculum, it's part of the training, and we have to strengthen all these ethics and, of course, all the obligations in the conventions to have those into the military training, so that there's no doubt that some activities are absolutely strictly forbidden, and also that they know that this is monitored. It's monitored to ensure compliance with the ethics and with the convention obligations, just to make that brief. So I think there's a long way to go from the story I told you. We have gone far, but there's still a lot to go, and there has to be reactions when things happen. And we know what's happening in Russia today. Russia has signed and ratified a number of conventions on these things. Nevertheless, we know it's happening. So as Betsy said, how can we approach when 1325 and all the other really legally binding conventions are being violated?
I don't have much to add. I just want to mention that Nora and I had a conference participated in a conference this summer where one of the other panelists was a gender advisor in the military. So they have 12 gender advisors based on the 1325 resolutions, and they are working constantly on trying to improve the military from within. So at least it's a start.
Okay, we have one additional question in the chat box, and it is for Betsy, saying, sorry to learn of your experience. 750 bases in 80 nations is a lot. Do you think America's increased interest in expanding the militarization of the Asia Pacific through the Indo-Pacific strategy will worsen the situation? Are you aware of the security establishment continuing to exploit women in places with military bases such as Philippines and Japan? And does this suggest that it would be better to have strategic autonomy and not have a dependence on America?
Well, one of the things that I found to be really heartening is that there was like a law passed, I think, recently, and I think President Biden has looked at it. In terms of if sexual violence happens within the military, they now have a new rule that the judges and the adjudicators are going to be non-military. In other words, they're going to have like extra military persons adjudicate sexual violence within the military forces itself. The reason I kept on bringing up the status force agreements is that so far the status of force agreements has seemed to fail to effectively adjudicate sexual violence that have been done by the U.S. military in Asia Pacific. Without going into too much detail, I just wanted to say that there is particular articles in the status of force agreements that needs to be updated and changed so that if crimes such as sexual violence do occur, that it's going to be easier to prosecute the criminals. And the reason why I think there's more of a voice for this is that, including under Denny Tamaki, the governor of Okinawa, is that many people are afraid that the expansion of the U.S. military in terms of the number of boots on the ground is going to create more of a chances of spreading U.S. military sexual violence and also prostitution. And just to show you, maybe this is coming backwards, but there's a book called, is it focusing?
It's not clear. I can share it later.
Okay, I can submit it later. It's called Let the Good Times Roll. It's a book about prostitution in the U.S. military in Asia Pacific. And that is what we're concerned about. So that I think that if we put our heads together and do analysis of it, there are many fine scholars and academics and heads of NGO organizations who have already done a study on this and to identify which articles in the status of force agreements to change. So that's my answer for now.
All right, I'll ask a question of Elizabeth. Have you heard from helpers who have used the manual and who have found it to be helpful? And I'll ask a question of Nora. You've mentioned the situation in Ukraine and the violations that have taken place there. We also have a situation in the Indo-Pacific region with the civil war that's ongoing in Myanmar. And there's also discussion of a possible invasion of Taiwan at some point in the next, possibly in the next decade. Do we have reason to believe that greater recognition of rape and other SGBV will reduce their occurrence in conflict? Okay, let's start with Elizabeth.
So thank you for the question. Actually, today I received a report from the latest training that the helpers of our collaborating partner in Nepal had. We had first we had the pilot training of the children's manual in November, and then we had an online TOT now in May, and now they had their own training for the local partners in Kathmandu, and the feedback and the word I'm looking for is testimony from the participants. Said that a lot of them have been working in different, like in the church, in the schools, at local small organizations, and they have seen changes in the children, but they thought it was the kids just acting out, but now they could recognize actual signs that this might be something more than just kids being naughty. So from previous trainings also, we have had women coming back to us and telling us that they didn't know that these were human rights violations. They didn't know they had rights. And so when they brought up these issues that they actually, this is actually a violation of their rights, and they felt empowered to do something about their situation. So it for us, it really shows that we cannot reach everyone, but we can reach the ones we can reach. It's really giving us courage to continue the work that we're doing.
All right.
Before I go to your question, I'd like to just to add to what Elizabeth is saying. This is, of course, always extremely difficult to measure, but from the feedback we get, and also the interest in having it translated and available in different languages, gives us the hope that this is something that really makes a difference. Because it's not a manual in the form that you're told exactly what to do. It's ideas, it's way of understanding, and also trying to understand from a more phenomenological view how is the life of a survivor and what does she need. So we do have, since we've been working on this now for about 12 years since we first launched, we think we do have quite a lot of feedback on this being useful for helpers. Not any magic formula, but definitely something which can also empower the helpers to approach the problems. And what you said, if we can, I've been working with human rights now for so many years, and I say if I stop being an optimist, I just have to give up, because there's so many grim things going on, and there's so many backlashes all the time. But I do think that given training, and provided that the military that are out do have training, that they have been working also in groups during the training in order to monitor themselves and be able to give feedback to themselves, and also a leadership which 100% respect what they're supposed to respect, both from a national and international perspective. I do hope, of course, that these forms of violations will not take place. I would wish all military in the world to be without any work and to do small interesting things in their camps. Unfortunately, they are called out as soldiers in battle, but I do hope that battle does not include systematic attacks on civilians, as we have seen. And I think what has come out recently, also encouraging civil society to report on what they see from the European jurist, to try to build up a big bank of documentation for the day that justice may be there. It is also important. So we need to work on prevention, and we need to work on documentation, and we just have to hope. I have to go on hoping. Thank you.
All right, we have one more question in the chat box, and this comes from our WPS program manager, Valeria. She says, thank you so much to the panel for your time and the information shared. My question is, are you familiar with what the US military is doing to train military gender advisors, not only in the US, but in some other military personnel in Asia, to continue fighting sexual violence at home and abroad? If you do, what is your opinion about it? Anyone want to take that on?
I can briefly take it on. You know, that's a really good question, and I myself, unfortunately, haven't gone into exactly the training for the US military, but in my experience in dealing with NATO here in Norway, that was working with the US military, I understood a few years ago that both NATO Norway and NATO USA, they had obligatory 1325 education curriculums. But I am not sure, you know, it'd be fantastic if I had a chance to go to Okinawa to be on the military bases to see if in Okinawa they have started training on 1325. Now that I think would be groundbreaking. And maybe Rob, you know, you might know through your contacts, military contacts, if they do 1325 training in Okinawa. I think that would be a really good thing. And another thing I discussed in my section was that I did some research with phone meetings and discussions with U.S. military academies on the mainland USA on the issues of U.S. military sexual gender-based violence. And although most of them said that they didn't have a particular curriculum on that they were very open to discussing both the history and the current need to address U.S. military sexual gender-based violence. And as far as I know, I think the U.S. Naval Academy has sharpened up because of the amount of rapes and sexual assaults that have been reported from the U.S. military academy. I think it was the Navy and also the Air Force. There was a huge scandal at the Air Forces, you know, having like an amazing number of sexual violence within their own armed commands. So I think that these are basically the beginning stages. I don't know if Nora or Elizabeth wants to add.
I was just tempting to add one thing. As late as yesterday, our prime minister visited soldiers in the US that have been trained in Norway. And in Norway, the 1325 training is very strong and very elaborate. They were giving a lot of examples of how the Norwegian soldiers had taught them to be warm in cold areas, and they found that interesting, which of course it is. But it would be very interesting to ask also our prime minister if he had encountered anyone who had referred to 1325 training, or we can find ways of asking them how much that has been implemented in their training. It should be. And according to US government, at least when I've met them in the UN Committee Against Torture, training of military also on gender issues is a high priority. Now, how it's practiced on the ground, it's another question, but it's a very important one, and I should really want to follow up. So thanks for raising it.
Elizabeth, do you have to add?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't have much to add other than I have a husband that have been in Iraq and in Afghanistan together with the U.S. military forces, and it seems like there is a very clear, at least Me Too awareness, which is a bit different, but still it's awareness about how to and there was quite a harsh penalty if there were any Me Too situations. So people were at least aware of those issues.
I was just going to quickly add concretely that under Joe Biden, I think it was like during COVID, there's like a new council on gender policies under the White House. It actually is a new council, and I don't know who is staffed there. I tried to approach the council to ask about these issues that we're talking about today, but there was no staff that could really answer my questions. So I'm hoping that going forth from now, maybe through PAC Forum, the WPS section, that you folks can find out more about what this new Biden's Council on Gender Policies is all about.
Right. I believe we have time for one final question. Then that comes from Yerin Yoon, who is our Korea Foundation Fellow. Betsy, thanks for sharing your experience and opinions. As you mentioned, there are already a lot of efforts to make improvements in international law and NGO section. However, it still feels challenging to have practical power to proceed with reconciliation in the real world, since politicians in both countries use this issue for political interests. So I'd like to ask if you have specific suggestions for both governments to make improvements.
Yes, thank you very much. I actually wanted to mention this. These are really precarious times. We have the ongoing war, the Russian war in Ukraine, which has steered the spotlight into security issues for Northeast Asia. And under the security geopolitical alliances, this is the time where Japan, Korea, and the USA have to be like this. There can be no distancing. So under these geopolitical, what I call it, allies of convenience, talking about gender-based violence, whether occurring now or historic, is really inconvenient. What I wanted to really express is that I did not want, this current time of the necessity of creating military alliances for us to not talk about historical and ongoing sexual violence. And, the reason why I brought up the RAA that happened in 1945 is that we still see similar patterns going on now, with Japan still not, able to talk about the RAA, and Japan still very reluctant to bring up again the Republic of Korea comfort women issues. And the United States is very reluctant to talk about the RAA, although they want to support the Korean comfort woman. So it's usually in most of the countries, especially Japan and South Korea, they don't really want to talk too much about issues in their own closets. And this is especially so for the Japanese governments. And so what I wanted to really bring up, I think is going to be really important, is that I praise the ROK government, even if the comfort woman has been politicized, that they have been at least able to support the voices of the comfort woman and their families. What I find really lacking in both Japan and the US government is that they're not willing to support the voices of Japanese women who had to serve the US military sexually during the RA time. So there's a great contrast, and I'm hoping that survivors like myself, and perhaps I might have the funds at some time to do a documentary of the RA issues. So if that becomes the case, then it'll be much more clear that I'm not making this story up, that this has actually happened, and that and I think what the audience, the question from the audience is really important, is that we need to amplify and support these women's voices, because we're lucky. I speak English, Japanese, Norwegian, and broken French. I get to go to the UN. I get to talk to civil society organizations, NGOs. If many more of these Asian, including the Japanese and Korean survivors, were able to speak English fluently or go to these NGOs, it'd be wonderful. But of course they can't. So it's our duty to help amplify their voices and carry it all the way out to the ICC or whatever it needs. So that's my theoretical, unicorn rainbow hope. But like Nora says, sometimes hope is all we have, right? So.
All right, do Nora or Elizabeth have anything to add to that? All right.
No, thank you. I think this was well said. Thank you.
All right, in that case, I would like to thank our three speakers for their great presentations and for taking the time to share their insights with us. As they were joining from a time zone 12 hours ahead of ours, I'm grateful they were willing to stay up that late. I also want to thank those of you who submitted questions and contributed to this enlightening discussion, and a special thanks to Program Manager Megan Tanaka for helping to make this special event happen smoothly. Thanks once again, everyone, and we will see you again in the near future. For Pacific Forum Fellows and Interns, I will see you next week at the usual time of Tuesday at 1 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. Stay well and stay safe, everyone.